The year is 1805. The air in the Bitterroot Mountains does not just carry a chill, it carries the scent of impending death. Here, at the roof of the North American continent, the oxygen is thin and the silence is absolute. A woman, barely more than a teenager, stands knee-deep in a drift of crystalline snow. On her back, wrapped in furs and a cradleboard, is a 2-month-old infant named Jean-Baptiste. His breath is a faint puff of white against the biting wind. This is not a scene from a painting. This is a desperate struggle for survival. Historical records from the journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark reflect a harrowing reality. The Corps of Discovery was starving, their horses were slipping down icy precipices, and the stony mountains were a labyrinth of granite and frost that threatened to swallow them whole. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the Lemhi Shoshone and the brutal geopolitical landscape of the early 19th century. Sacagawea was not a volunteer explorer in the modern sense. She was a survivor of a violent raid, a captive sold into marriage to a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau, and now the linchpin of an American empire's greatest gamble. As she stepped forward into the freezing gale, she wasn't just walking, she was calculating. Every step required an intimate knowledge of a landscape that showed no mercy. The physical toll of postpartum recovery, combined with the caloric deficit of a mountain crossing, would have broken most men. Yet she remained the steady heartbeat of the expedition. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The harsh reality of the 1805 winter meant that a single mistake, a slipped footing on a shale slope or a misjudged river crossing, was a death sentence. In June of that year, near the Great Falls of the Missouri, a sudden flash flood turned a dry ravine into a churning torrent of mud and rock. While the men scrambled for safety, Sacagawea found herself trapped, the water rising to her waist in seconds, threatening to sweep both her and her child into the abyss. This was the threshold. It was the moment where the fear of the unknown met the biological instinct to protect. Captain Clark would later write of her fortitude in this moment, noting that she did not lose her cool or her grip on the child. She saved the very instruments and journals that would eventually document their success, all while the icy water clawed at her legs. This was the technical reality of the frontier. Life was measured in inches and seconds. The mountain passes they were attempting to navigate reached elevations where the human body begins to fail. The mountain fever and the sheer exhaustion of the climb were secondary to the psychological weight of being the only woman among nearly 30 men, carrying the future of her people and the burden of an infant in a wilderness that wanted them dead. She was the bridge between the known world of the East and the ancient sovereign lands of the West. If she fell, the expedition's chance of peaceful contact with the Shoshone, the only people who could provide the horses necessary to cross the mountains, would vanish. The weight she carried was not just the child on her back, but the hope of a peaceful passage. Historical analysis suggests that her presence alone served as a white flag of peace. No war party traveled with a woman and an infant. She was the silent diplomat, the human shield, and the expert navigator, all while enduring the biting hunger that forced the men to eat their own candles and horses just to stay alive. The snow in the Rockies is a suffocating blanket, and as the group pushed higher toward the Continental Divide, the stakes became existential. Her feet, clad in simple buckskin moccasins, were often soaked and freezing, a condition that leads to necrosis in hours. Yet, the journals never record a word of complaint from her. This was the silent strength that defined the American West, not the roar of a rifle, but the steady, rhythmic step of a mother refusing to let the cold take her child or her purpose. The expedition reached a point where the mountains seemed endless, a sea of peaks, as Lewis described them. Here, at the threshold of the Pacific, Sacagawea faced the ghost of her own past. She was returning to the lands of her birth not as a queen, but as a guide for strangers. The psychological pressure of this homecoming, coupled with the physical agony of the climb, creates a portrait of a woman whose resilience remains unparalleled in the annals of exploration. She was walking through a graveyard of ice, carrying life in her arms and leading a nation toward its future. To look at the life of Sacagawea through the lens of the 1800s is to see a world where every object carried a history of labor and every tradition was a tool for survival. While the men of the Corps of Discovery focused on the great objectives, mapping the Missouri, cataloging new species of flora and fauna, and claiming territory, Sacagawea lived in what historians call the history of the everyday. Her world was defined by the weight of a cradleboard, the texture of dried camas roots, and the rhythmic scraping of hide. The reality of the 1800s meant that for a woman in her position, there was no distinction between work and life. Every waking second was an exercise in maintaining the delicate balance between the group's survival and the life of her son, Jean-Baptiste, whom the explorers nicknamed Pomp. The archive of life is found in the tools she used. While Meriwether Lewis carried a sophisticated sextant to measure the stars, Sacagawea carried the ancient knowledge of the earth. When the expedition's food supplies dwindled to nothing but rancid salt pork and parched corn, it was Sacagawea who looked at the seemingly barren riverbanks and saw a feast. She understood the forgotten customs of gathering. Using a simple sharpened digging stick, a tool as old as the mountains themselves, she would uncover caches of wild artichokes hidden by meadow mice or identify the edible roots that the men, in their topographical blindness, simply stepped over. Historical records from this era show that her ability to forage was not merely a helper's task, it was a vital caloric contribution that kept the men from the brink of scurvy and starvation. The contrast between the hardness of the present and the memories of her past was constant. On her back, the cradleboard, or papoose, was a masterpiece of Shoshone engineering. Constructed from willow wood and lined with soft moss or down from cattails, it served as a mobile sanctuary for her infant. This wasn't just a carrier, it was a psychological anchor. As she navigated the treacherous slopes of the Rockies, the rhythmic movement of her gait would soothe the child, a stark contrast to the chaotic swearing of the men and the braying of exhausted pack horses. We must understand that in the reality of 1805, childcare was an extreme sport. There were no pauses for the mother. If the group moved, she moved. If the wind howled at 40 below zero, she had to ensure the heat from her own body was transferred to the child, wrapped in buffalo robes. The archive also lived in her silence. In the journals of Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea is often a background figure until a crisis occurs. This silence, however, was a form of profound wisdom. In many indigenous cultures of the era, speech was reserved for necessity, and observation was the highest form of intelligence. While the expedition leaders debated routes and argued over maps, Sacagawea was reading the text of the landscape. The way the lichen grew on the north side of the rocks, the smell of water on the wind, and the familiar silhouettes of the peaks she had seen before her capture by the Hidatsa years prior. Her memory was her map, an internal archive of a childhood spent in these very valleys. The physical toll of this period cannot be overstated. The historical reality of the 1880s, and certainly the 1800s, involved a level of physical grit that is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Every piece of clothing she wore, she likely had a hand in maintaining. Her moccasins, made of elk or deer hide, would wear through in days on the jagged volcanic rock of the Bitterroots. To stay mobile, she would have to sew and repair them by firelight, using sinew for thread and a bone awl for a needle. This was the labor behind the legend. While the story focuses on the destination, the history is in the thousands of tiny, agonizing stitches and the constant ache in her shoulders from the weight of the child. There is a poignant moment in the archives that captures this contrast. When the expedition finally encountered the Shoshone, Sacagawea realized the chief, Kameawait, was her own brother. In a rare display of raw emotion, she threw her blanket over him and wept. Yet even in this moment of overwhelming personal history, she immediately returned to her role as the bridge. She didn't just celebrate, she negotiated. She translated the needs of the Americans into the tongue of her people, ensuring that the horses, the ultimate tools of survival, were secured. She was the curator of two worlds, balancing the memories of her lost family with the cold, hard requirements of the mission at hand. This was her archive of life, a repository of survival, a testament to the fact that history is not just made by treaties, but by the quiet, unrelenting resilience of those who keep life moving forward when the world turns to ice. To stand at the crest of the continental divide in 1805 was to stand at the edge of the known universe. For the men of the Corps of Discovery, the isolation was geographical and professional. They were soldiers far from their chain of command. But for Sacagawea, the isolation was a profound, multifaceted weight that pressed against her soul with the same cold force as the mountain air. She was a woman of perhaps 16 or 17, the only woman among a rough, desperate band of 31 men. Historical records from this era show that the psychological landscape of the frontier was often more treacherous than the physical one. She lived in a permanent state of betweenness, captured by the Hidatsa, sold to a Frenchman, and now navigating for Americans. She was surrounded by voices, yet she was profoundly alone. The harsh reality of the 1800s meant that Sacagawea existed in a vacuum of identity. To the Americans, she was a squaw, a term used with the clinical detachment of the time to describe an indigenous woman who was more of a logistical asset than a peer. To her husband, Charbonneau, she was a possession, a translator and a laborer whose physical well-being was secondary to his own comfort. We must look at the forgotten customs of the era to understand the mental fortitude required to maintain one's sanity in such a position. In the silence of the high Rockies, where the only sound was the crunch of snow and the whistling of the wind through the pines, the psychological isolation would have been deafening. Consider the impact of this isolation on the psyche of a young mother. There was no sister, no mother, no elder woman to guide her through the terrors of her first months of motherhood in a frozen wasteland. When Jean-Baptiste fell ill with mumps or high fevers, as recorded in the journals, Sacagawea had to rely entirely on her own ancestral knowledge and the rudimentary, often dangerous medical kits of Lewis and Clark. The isolation was not just about the miles between her and the nearest village, it was the lack of a shared language of the heart. Every decision she made for her child was hers alone to bear. If the boy died, her grief would have been a private ghost in a camp of men focused on the next ridge. The stony mountains acted as a psychological barrier that broke even the strongest men in the party. Men like John Collins and Hugh Hall faced lashes for wandering or for the despair of the spirit that led to dereliction of duty. Yet, Sacagawea remained the psychological anchor of the group. Why? Because her isolation was her strength. She had already survived the greatest trauma a human could endure, the violent kidnapping from her people and the total loss of her previous life. To her, the mountains were not a barrier but a homecoming. While the men looked at the peaks with dread, seeing only a wall of granite blocking their path to the Pacific, Sacagawea looked at them with the recognition of a survivor. Historians often analyze the silent strength of indigenous guides through the lens of stoicism, but it is more accurate to call it a tactical resilience. In the journals, Captain Clark notes her quietude and her uncomplaining nature during the most brutal stretches of the Bitterroot Crossing, where the group was reduced to eating portable soup, a glue-like concoction of boiled beans and meat, and eventually their own horses. This was a psychological battle against the void. The isolation of the Great Divide meant that if they vanished, no one would ever know their names. In this void, Sacagawea's connection to her child was her only tether to a future. Every time she adjusted the straps of the cradle board, she was reclaiming a piece of her humanity from the vast, indifferent wilderness. The psychological pressure of being the bridge between cultures cannot be overstated. When the expedition finally neared the lands of the Shoshone, the pressure shifted. She was no longer just a traveler. She was the herald of a changing world. She knew that the men she led were the vanguard of an expansion that would irrevocably alter the lives of her people. To be the one who opens the door to your own home for strangers who will eventually take it is a burden of historical proportions. She navigated the thin line between loyalty to her roots and the immediate necessity of the expedition's success. This was the true isolation. The loneliest place in the world is the mind of a person who understands both the past they lost and the future that is coming to replace it. The ascent into the Bitterroot Mountains in September 1805 was the crucible that nearly extinguished the core of discovery. Historical records from this era show a descent into a literal and figurative cold hell. The temperature plummeted, and the group was forced to navigate the Lolo Trail, a path so steep and choked with fallen timber that even the horses, bred for these mountains, began to lose their footing and tumble into the ravines below. This was the breaking point. The men, hardened soldiers and hunters like George Drouillard and John Coulter, were reduced to shadows of themselves, their bodies failing from a lack of protein and the relentless, bone-deep dampness of the melting snow. In the center of this collapsing morale stood Sacagawea. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of the human body under extreme duress. She was not just navigating a mountain, she was sustaining a life. Her infant, Jean-Baptiste, was now 7 months old, a weight that shifted with every lunging step she took to avoid a fall. The biological demand on a nursing mother in a sub-zero environment is astronomical. Her body was burning thousands of calories just to maintain her core temperature, yet she was forced to survive on portable soup and scraps of coyote meat. The harsh reality of the 1800s meant that if her milk failed, the child died. There was no alternative. This was the ultimate high-stakes survival, a silent war waged within her own veins to keep the future alive while her surroundings succumbed to the frost. The climax of her physical grit occurred during a relentless storm that Lewis described as thick and snowy. The trail had vanished. The expedition was lost in a vertical wilderness of granite and ice. As the men huddled together, their spirits broken by the realization that they might never see the Pacific or their homes. Again, Sacagawea's resilience became the silent fuel for their progress. There is a gravity to her presence in the journals during these days. She is the only member of the party who does not falter. While the men wrote of their excessive fatigue and gloomy prospects, Sacagawea moved with the mechanical precision of a woman who knew that the moment you stop moving in the Rockies is the moment the mountains claim you. The breaking point was not a single explosion of action, but a sustained, agonizing act of will. It was the sound of her breath hollowing out in the thin air, the feeling of the raw leather of her moccasins freezing to her skin, and the piercing cry of a hungry child that no one else could comfort. In the journals, Clark notes that during the worst of the crossing, Sacagawea remained patient and attentive. This patience was actually a form of tactical stoicism, a psychological shield against the sheer terror of their isolation. The historical reality of the Great Divide meant that the Corps was one misplaced step from becoming a footnote in history, a lost colony of the West. If Sacagawea had collapsed, the expedition's moral compass would have shattered. She was the visual proof that life could persist even here. Her silhouette against the white peaks, a mother carrying a child through a wasteland, was a rebuke to the men's despair. She was the bridge not just between tribes, but between the brink of death and the possibility of a legacy. When they finally crested the final ridge and saw the waters that led to the Columbia River, it wasn't a victory of conquest, it was a victory of endurance. Sacagawea had carried her son through the coldest gates of the continent, her body a shield against the elements. her mind a map of a world the Americans were only beginning to fear. She had reached the breaking point of human capability, and instead of shattering, she had simply stepped across it. When the cause of discovery finally descended from the frozen heights of the Rockies into the Clearwater River Valley, they were not the proud explorers who had left St. Louis. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed men who had looked into the abyss of starvation and seen their own ends. Historical records from this era show that the physical aftermath of the mountain crossing was nearly as deadly as the climb itself. The men, ravenous after weeks of deprivation, gorged themselves on camas roots and dried salmon provided by the Nez Perce, leading to violent dysentery that incapacitated nearly the entire party. In this moment of collective collapse, the silent strength of Sacagawea shifted from the physical endurance of the trail to the logistical maintenance of a dying camp. The harsh reality of the 1800s meant that recovery was a slow, painful process. While the men lay in their tents, weakened by the very food meant to save them, Sacagawea remained the functional heart of the expedition. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of indigenous medicine and the role of the woman as the primary caregiver. She was one of the few who did not succumb entirely to the cama sickness, likely due to her lifelong familiarity with the route and a biological resilience forged by her harrowing journey. She continued to care for Jean-Baptiste, whose survival through the sub-zero trek remains one of the great miracles of American frontier history. The aftermath of the Great Divide also brought a shift in the expedition's power dynamics. Captain Clark's journals begin to reflect a deepening respect and a burgeoning paternal affection for both Sacagawea and her son. He began to refer to her as Janie, a sign of familiar bond that was rare for a man of his station toward an indigenous woman. This wasn't just sentiment, it was the recognition of a debt. Without her presence, they would have had no horses. Without her knowledge, they would have had no food. Without her child, they would have been perceived as a war party, and likely wiped out by the first Shoshone or Nez Perce scouts they encountered. But for Sacagawea, the aftermath was bittersweet. She had crossed the mountains only to reach the Pacific, a great water she had never seen, but which represented the furthest point from the home she had briefly reclaimed. Historical analysis of her behavior at the coast reveals a woman who was acutely aware of her value. When a beached whale was reported near the saltworks and the men prepared to see it, Sacagawea demanded to go. The journals record her stating that she had traveled a long way to see the great waters, and it would be hard if she could not see the big fish as well. This was a rare moment of self-assertion, a claim to her own place in the historical narrative. She was no longer just a captive or a guide. She was a witness to history. The historical aftermath for Sacagawea, however, is clouded by the limitations of the era's record-keeping. Once the expedition returned east in 1806, she effectively vanished from the official American ledger. She was paid nothing. Her husband, Charbonneau, received 533 and 322 acres of land. Sacagawea received only the grateful thanks of the captains. This is the sting of the archive. The person who carried the most weight is often the one given the least space in the ledger. Yet the aftermath lives on in the legacy of her son. Clark eventually took Jean-Baptiste to St. Louis to be educated, a testament to the bond formed in the frozen peaks. Sacagawea's life after the trail is a subject of historical debate. Some records suggest she died in 1812 of putrid fever at Fort Manuel, while Shoshone oral tradition maintains she lived a long life, returning to her people and dying in 1884. Regardless of the date of her passing, the aftermath of her journey redefined the American map. She had proven that the continent could be crossed, not just by soldiers, but by a mother and her child. She had turned a wilderness into a trail, and a conquest into a story of human endurance. To look upon the statue of Sacagawea today, often bronze, stoic and serene, is to see a sanitized version of a woman whose true legacy was written in sweat, blood, and the freezing mist of the bitterroots. The historical reality of the early 1800s was a world that demanded everything from those it displaced. Sacagawea did not just guide an expedition, she endured it. She survived the trauma of kidnapping, the indignity of being traded like a commodity, and the physical agony of a transcontinental trek while nursing an infant. When we analyze her place in the great tapestry of history, we see a woman who acted as the ultimate bridge between the Stone Age tools of her ancestors and the industrial expansion of a young United States, and between the hostile silence of the mountains and the survival of 31 men. Historical records from this era show that the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition, the very foundation of the American West, rested on the shoulders of a teenager who was never officially enlisted. Her legacy is found in the forgotten customs of resilience. It is the wisdom of knowing when to speak and when to listen, when to forage and when to fight. She was the silent strength because she had to be. In a world of loud men seeking glory, she was the quiet force of nature that ensured there was a story left to tell. Her son, Jean-Baptiste, lived to be a polyglot, a traveler of Europe, and a mayor in California, a living extension of the path his mother carved through the ice. He was the fruit of her endurance, a child of the wilderness who walked into the modern world because a mother refused to let the cold take him. We must reflect on the gravity of her sacrifice. Sacagawea represents the millions of indigenous voices whose labor and knowledge built the foundations of the world we inhabit today, often without compensation or even a name in the ledgers. Her story is a testament to the fact that the most powerful historical figures are often those who never sought the spotlight, but whose presence was the only thing standing between a mission's success and its total annihilation. She reminds us that staying wild is not just about the landscape. It is about the untamed spirit that refuses to break, no matter how heavy the burden or how deep the snow. As the wind whistles through the mountain passes she once climbed, her silhouette remains a permanent fixture of the American psyche. She is the mother of the West, the guardian of the trail, and the proof that human grit is the only map that truly matters. Her journey was not just a crossing of a continent, it was a triumph of the human heart over the indifferent machinery of nature and time. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.